Alrighty, we are live. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, folks. Just gonna give folks a couple minutes to drop into the chat room, get started, and then we'll dive into card anatomy. How's everybody doing today? At least it's not midnight. Yeah, the last one was, I understand that it's not easy for everybody to make them when they're at midnight. Noon is easier for some folks, but we are an international organization, and there's some folks that this time is midnight, or even later than that. So, just want to make sure that everybody has an opportunity to get in on some of these live lessons and hear me talk straight to the camera, rather than listening to that ye old pre-recorded voice. I'm ideally sometime in maybe October gonna try and spread it out so we have at least US Eastern Time noon, 6 p.m. and midnight, so we have a little bit more variety, because I know a lot of people are working and are unable to watch videos while at work. I also know that some people are working and are able to watch videos and streams while at work, so I want to make sure that we get to as many different people as possible over various streams. Ideally, everybody shows up for one stream all at once and I get 2,000 people in the chat and I can't control y'all. But, I mean, I was never able to control any of you to begin with. So, good to see y'all here. And as always, if at any point you have any questions about the lesson or anything else, please feel free to drop into the chat. I have an eye over on that. I will absolutely 100%, as always, go on tangents to talk about whatever you throw my way rather than just talking about what we have in front of us. But without further ado, let's talk about what cards look like. I still love that circular swipe, that clock swipe. That transition just makes me feel happy. Anyways, we're going to be talking about card anatomy. This is section 2 of the comprehensive rules out of, what, 13 sections? Yeah, 13 sections. So, we're working on... Oh my god. Curse Strife. Ray is a red card, right? So I was playing with a friend on Saturday, introducing them to the game. We cracked some packs of Shadow of the Galaxy. We're sorting cards to build a deck. They absolutely put... they got a Hyper Ray and just slammed it into the red pile. I'm like... So that isn't actually a red card. I know that the only color that you can see is red, but it's actually a blue card. Malcor, are there links to the comprehensive rules? Yes, there absolutely are. Let me see if I can pull one up for you. We have some available on our resources page on Nexus, so if you go to nexus.cascadegames.com/resources, you can find it there. This is a direct link to the current version of the CR, and we're going to keep this page up to date with pretty much all of the links you could ever want. Rules, policy, various updates and clarifications, resources for other tools such as Melee, which is the scorekeeping software. We want to try and keep a bunch of references just in one place so it's easier to find stuff and you don't have to say, go to Twitter every time you want to double check your rules. Right, so let's dive in. As was already brought up, cards aren't always going to look like what we talk about today or what we show today. I use the non-hyperspace versions of cards in my slides on purpose. This is the default version of the card. This is what the card is going to look like most of the time. I'm going to try to avoid using promos or other cards like that, because they're going to have different formatting, and while it's important to be able to recognize a card for a card, that's not what the rules are going to reference. The rules aren't going to reference the special layouts that Showcase leaders have or convention-exclusive promos have. None of them are going to mention any sort of, like, foil stamp saying judge or top 8 competitor, that sort of thing. So just keep that in mind as we go through the card anatomy, because cards aren't gonna... they're not gonna look like this lovely Darth Vader that we have here. Now, every card, there are a bunch of different attributes that a card can have. Every card has, at minimum, a name, a type, traits, and credit. Any card can have, but does not necessarily have, a subtitle, cost, aspects, and text. It's mostly units that don't have text. Tokens don't have cost. And some events, units, and upgrades don't have aspects. And that also applies to tokens because they're, treated as their parent type. But those cards without aspects are neutral cards. Most cards don't have subtitle. So far it's only units. But we'll see how that plays out with regard to unique upgrades. Yes. What doesn't have cost? Does anything not have cost? Am I crazy? I think I'm crazy. I think everything has a cost. Yeah, because tokens do have a cost of 0. You just can't play them, but that cost is there for reference purposes. So if you have something that says deal with an upgrade that has cost N or less, you can see that it's a nice 0. I should update that in the text of this presentation. Yes, bases don't have cost. Yep, Pre-Vizsla cares about the cost of upgrades. I think there's another one too, but I can't remember off the top of my head, and that's not relevant to this part of this lesson. Units have an arena type, power, and HP. They always have these, otherwise they don't function as units. Bases have HP, otherwise they don't function as bases. And upgrades have power modifiers and HP modifiers. Those numbers can and frequently are 0, especially for ones that you want to be putting onto enemy units. So, name and subtitles. Multiple cards can have the same name. Chewbacca exists 3 times over already. We've got a couple Mauls, we got a couple Darth Vaders, we got 3 Boba Fett's, 2 Jabba's. For the purposes of identification, each card's name is their English name. It's very possible that using loan words from other languages, the English name has something that is, say, a Germanic root. And then they use a synonymous word in English that doesn't have a synonym in German, and so German card might have 2 cards with the same name. This is something that's come up in Magic: The Gathering. At some point, when you have 25,000, 30,000 unique cards, translating card names, you sometimes run into duplication issues. I think, one of the early cards was, Stormgeist, and then they printed a card that was Storm Ghost, and when they translated Storm Ghost into German, they were like, well, Storm is going to be Storm either way, it's going to be Storm, and then Ghost just translates to Geist, and so we have another version of Stormgeist in our game, and there's not really a better word for it, so we're stuck with that. Octurnal asks, can't give a general description of a card or character, like if you forget the name of a character but know what the card does or what the character looks like. You can absolutely, you do not have to name the full card name when speaking with your opponent. To name a card, you need to be able to uniquely identify it. If you say, it's the blue Chewbacca, that's not enough to, or rather, Chewbacca is enough. If you were naming a non-unique character, so let's say you're trying to name Regional Governor, and you say, we're going into hypothetical land, you're naming Regional Governor with Regional Governor, but you can't remember the name of Regional Governor, you can say the card that's a 1/4 that's blue, that has a when played when you name a card. If your opponent understands what card you're talking about, great. If your opponent doesn't understand what card you're talking about, you can call for a judge and ask them to help you identify the card. You need to be able to give them enough information so that they can say, absolutely 100% this is the card you're talking about, and then they can give you access to that information. And then you'll be able to get the name that way. You can absolutely say something like, saying Slave 1 instead of Vet's Fire Spray will get the point across to most people. Falcon from set 1 will do the job for naming the Millennium Falcon. When we say, when naming a card, you must name a full card name, what we mean is you can't just say Governor or Admiral. If you just say Admiral, that's, one, not a full card name. There's no card in Star Wars Unlimited called Admiral. And if you were able to do that, you'd be able to hit, like, Admiral Motti and Admiral Yularen and several other admirals under one name. So the name has to be a full name, and then it needs to match exactly with the name of a card. So, for example, you can't name Maul and prevent them from playing Darth Maul with Regional Governor. Maul is a different name than Darth Maul. So Maul is a complete name, but does not include Darth Maul. Alright, McFerguson asks, so that policy question about judges only being able to answer questions related to public information about what's on the table already is going to be changed. Yep, 100%. I've spoken with FFG. That is something that they are going to be changing. They're just going to delete that line, is my understanding, from policy that has that restriction. Tennessee Feet Monk says, policy clarifications on the Nexus I'm taking as writ for upcoming PQs. That's a great place to be. I believe they're planning on updating the official documents and actually getting that published and out there. And I've spoken with them about some of the changes that they want to make that aren't already in the existing policy clarifications, and I'm going to update that before the policy, the planetary qualifiers get started. I'm also going to try and reach out to all of the planetary qualifier head judges with a little bit of a primer, being like, hey, there's a bunch of stuff, here's a bunch of stuff that isn't quite ready for documentation, but I can have a conversation with you. As I mentioned yesterday in the Discord, I've been somewhat hesitant to talk about policy because it's in flux and it's very complicated, and I don't want to provide partial education to 2,500 people, but with like 30 or 40 head judges, it's easier to communicate directly with them, answer questions, and get them to a place where I'm comfortable with their knowledge, especially when it's something as not set in stone as this policy is. So Ed 4122 says, can we use cards from different languages? Absolutely, you can use cards in any printed language, any official card. You still need to make sure that you're being clear about what you're naming or the identity of the card. If your opponent doesn't understand what the card says or does, it's your responsibility to make sure that they have the opportunity to know what the card does. Great. Moving on. We're going to keep on talking about names a little bit more because there's so much to talk about names. Unique and copy. This little star symbol indicates uniqueness. A copy must have all attributes be the same to count as a copy. And subtitles remove ambiguity. For example, if you had... what do we have? This is as close as I can get. We're going into hypothetical territory. Like I say, never to do, but we're always going to get hypothetical here, because right now the card pool isn't so large that it covers every possibility that the rules do, but I want you to have this knowledge just in case it comes up. If, for example, you had Chewbacca Pikesbane and another blue 8-cost unit named Chewbacca, or a blue heroic named Chewbacca that's an underworld Wookiee, and its power was 4 and 10, and you played Force Lightning on both of them and removed their abilities, they would have all the same attributes. They'd be ground units with a cost of 8, same aspect, same power and hit points, same traits. The only thing that would be different is, because they're unique, their subtitle. Right now there's nothing that can interact with subtitle, so even if you're able to modify the other attributes of a card and you're able to modify a lot of them. We're able to modify power and HP very easily. We're able to modify the abilities that a card has relatively easily. We're able to modify traits through, I think, just Foundling. But we're able to modify traits. If you were to make two unique units look the same, except for their subtitle, they would still be different. And because things can't affect subtitle, your opponent wouldn't be able to uniqueness you out of one of those units. That is a heck of a corner case. Some might even call it a non-Euclidean corner case. But it's something that I thought of, and it's one of the reasons we have subtitles. In addition to being important for writing or registering decks, if you're submitting a deck for a deck list, don't just write Chewbacca, because there are 3 of them, and you can play any of them in your deck. You can't play 3 Walking Carpets in your deck because he's a leader, but you can play 3 Loyal Companions or 3 Pikesbane, even in a deck that isn't Vigilance or Heroic, because aspect penalties just means you can play anything. McFerguson says, Foundling is the only card with trait in the ability text currently. That's what I thought, at least when I was putting together this presentation, whenever I was putting this together, but they've been releasing new cards at an astounding rate, and so I want to make sure that I don't get caught off guard. And if somebody's watching this in the future, 1, hello from the past, and 2, please let me know if there's a card other than Foundling in the future that lets you modify traits. So, as discussed earlier, players can request card details from a judge even without the name. As long as both players are clear, nicknames or shorthand can be used. Open fire is here because if you call for a judge and say, hey judge, what's the name of the card that is an aggression 3-cost event that deals 4 damage to unit and nothing else, they'll be able to identify that as just open fire. There's no other card that does exactly that, and so they can identify that for you. If you say SLT instead of Super Laser Technician, your opponent might understand it. If you say DJ Death Star, they might not understand it, but you might be able to get to the point where you and your opponent both understand DJ Death Star means Super Laser Technician, and that's totally fine. That big honkin' ship might be the Avenger, and as long as both of you understand big honkin' ship means Avenger, you're good to go. Sometimes this can be context dependent. If you're playing a deck and you're playing Darth Maul Revenge at Last in your deck and your opponent plays Kira and they see your hand and they see Darth Maul Revenge at Last and then they name Maul, well, I'm going to go out and venture a guess that they are not in fact naming Maul Shadow Collective Visionary, but instead they're naming the card that will kill them that's in your hand. If you're uncertain, ask them for clarification. You cannot really take advantage of ambiguity to gain an advantage here. If your opponent names Maul and you're like, okay, I'm going to assume you named Maul, the actual card, and not the card that I had in my hand, and you go to play Darth Maul and they say, Judge, I named that card with Regional Governor or with Kira, they're not paying enough or they're not allowed to play it, I would ask, why did you think that they were naming a card that isn't in your hand when they're naming a card partially with Kira? And I would be very likely to rule with the player who named the card incompletely with that context, and go over that ambiguity. So we want players to communicate more clearly, and if they have questions, ask their opponent or ask a judge, rather than making assumptions, because players making assumptions is what leads us to errors. We got a bunch of questions. So at 4122, rarity and expansion set are not part of the card, right? Like, a copy of Surprise Attack from set 1 and set 2 are considered the same copy, or even if they reprinted with alternative art. Yes. This text down at the bottom is all different. Or not different, sorry. It's all not part of the card's attributes. J-Freak, this wouldn't mean that if you played a copy of a unique card with an ability that changed the attributes of the card, it would be allowed. New Count Dooku gives the next Separatist card you play Exploit 3 as an example. That is a great question. Let me look at these rules real quick and see exactly what they say. So we're going to jump to section 8, which is more information. 8.6 is copy. Printed attributes are what determine if a card is another card. So you ignore everything else. So my hypothetical doesn't matter because the rules cover this. So we're looking at just what's printed on the card itself. So, McFerguson, you ask, you say big honkin' vigilant ship and my opponent says gotcha, but we're thinking of two different things. How is that resolved? It'll come up when you play a big honkin' vigilant ship or they play big honkin' vigilant ship and you're like, that's what I meant. And they're like, oh, I didn't think that's what you meant. You call for a judge and the judge handles things from there. In the case of not specific language like big honkin' vigilant ship, we're going to have a conversation with players about why they expected their opponent to know what they were talking about. If, say, I had just used Rival's Fall and I'm like, I'm going to kill your big honkin' vigilant ship, and they're like, yep, got it, and then you're like, I play Regional Governor, naming big honkin' vigilant ship, and you point at that card, and they say gotcha, and then they try and play it later and be like, oh, I thought you meant this completely different ship, I would have a lot of questions for them. If you didn't establish this shorthand at all, and you hadn't seen any any capital ships with vigilance, and they played, what is it? The big one with smuggle that I can't remember the name of. You know the one that I'm talking about. If they play that and then you're like, oh, that's the one that I named, I'd be like, okay, why are you why that one, right? Like, the player who named it did not name it unambiguously. It could have been Dying Light. It's not Dying Light. God, where's my brain today? See, I'm no better at remembering cards in the middle of the day than I am at midnight. First Light, that's the one. Yeah, see? I'm smart. I know what I'm talking about. So if they play First Light, and you're like, yeah, that's absolutely the card I named, you're not allowed to play that. But that card hadn't been revealed, hadn't been discussed at all. I'm going to talk with that player and be like, so why did you call First Light big honkin' vigilant ship and not Avenger? Why weren't you more specific? That sort of thing. Exactly, yeah. If there's an Avenger sitting in the discard, and they're trying to get around it, trying to be ambiguous to gain an advantage, they're not going to get away with that. We don't let them do that. If you're just saying big honkin' vigilant ship, or the thing that kills me, or the thing that I can't beat, and your opponent knows what you're talking about, and you've had conversation about it, like, if you're like, yeah, if Avenger sticks around for a turn, I can't beat it, and then you play Regional Governor and say, the card that I can't beat, they're like, yeah, 100% I know what you're talking about. That's fine. If there's any ambiguity at all, we need to investigate, talk with the players, and figure out what's going on. Players may try to play dumb, but that's part of what an investigation is for. We're going to talk... Gosh. So, we're going to talk about investigations eventually. It's going to be several lessons. For those of you who are concerned right now about investigations, and I know it's a lot of you, I deeply, deeply recommend you look up Eric Shukan's articles on Collateral Truths. It's a series of older articles, at this point probably 15 years old, maybe 20 years old, and it's talking about cheating investigations in Magic the Gathering. But it's this idea of creating a picture or timeline of events that happened for us to get to this situation, and then building one truth onto another. It's the Collateral Truth series by Eric Shukan. Let me see if I can pull it up and drop a link into chat real quick. Alrighty. Here's the first one. So, the idea here for investigations is you build up a story, you build up an image of the events that happened. The player played Regional Governor, they said big honkin' vigilant ship, their opponent said gotcha, and now they're playing Avenger, and the regional governor player is saying, that's the card that I named. How do you know if they're cheating, right? You have this story of events, and you say, okay, what would confirm this story, or what would change my mind from this story? If both players say, yes, we previously referred to the Avenger as Big Honkin' Vigilant Ship, and there's one in a discard pile and a way that it was defeated, and both players agree that all of this happened, then I can pretty reasonably assume that, yeah, both players knew what we were talking about when I said Big Honkin' Vigilant Ship. If one player's claiming, I thought you meant First Light, and the other player's claiming, I thought you meant Avenger, again, we can look on what things would need to be true for this story to be true. If, again, we have an Avenger in a discard pile, and a player's like, yeah, when that died, we called it the Big Honkin' Vigilance Ship. And so that's what I assumed they were naming. I'd be like, cool, that's a pretty strong truth that is supporting this story. And some truths rely on other truths. So I would ask the player who played Regional Governor, who defeated the Avenger, hey, did your opponent play an Avenger? Did you defeat it? Did you refer to it by its name, or did you refer to it by a nickname? That sort of thing. And you can build up a story of, yeah, the player says, yep, that was in play. Yes, I defeated it. No, I only called it Avenger. I did not call it Big Honkin' Vigilance Ship. And at that point, you do have to make a judgment call of, these players are giving you conflicting pieces of information, that one of them supports a certain narrative and the other one doesn't, and you have to make a judgment call there. But what you can do is collect more and more and more information and make a call based on that. Going into like body language is something that is not great for investigations, because let's say somebody is avoiding your gaze. A lot of people are like, hey, if they're looking at their feet or looking away from me, that's because they're uncomfortable and lying. That's a possibility. Or it's because they're innocent, feel like they're being accused of cheating, and are just nervous about being investigated for cheating. If a player's story changes, maybe it's because they're lying to you and they're changing their story. Or maybe they did genuinely remember a new piece of information. If a player, has closed off or open body language, it could be them acting a certain way to try and get you to do something. Unless you're a body language reading expert, which there are 5 in the world, so I don't think you are, don't use body language as a part of your judgment in an investigation. Yeah, a lot of neurodivergent people will look away or not react in the same way. I also am neurodivergent, and in investigations, I try to match the person that I'm talking to. If they're trying to make eye contact, I'll make eye contact with them. If they're not making eye contact, I will let them not make eye contact. Investigations are a heck of a thing. They're no fun for anybody, because as a player, you don't want to be investigated for cheating. You don't want to be accused of cheating, because that sucks. And as a judge, you really, really hope that there isn't a cheater in your event. It would just be so nice if they were an idiot and not trying to scam all of the players. And so they're no fun for anybody. They can be very interesting, but we'll talk about them later. That's a huge, huge topic all on its own, and I will have many, many lessons about investigations. So at 4122 asks, what if I suspect a card is a proxy or a fake? I don't know what counterfeit detection methods are reliable with Star Wars Unlimited. That is not my area of expertise, and it is not your job as a judge. So, as an employee of Cascade Games, partnered with FFG, part of what I need to do as part of my job there is protect the brand and IP of FFG. As somebody who's running an event at your local game store, your job is to make sure that the event is run well, your job is not necessarily to police for counterfeits and proxies. Generally, you should, if you discover them or you're aware of them, not have them in your event. They're not allowed because, one, that's against FFG policy, and two, it undermines the whole ecosystem. If players don't buy cards, stores don't make money, they can't run events, players and judges don't have a place to exist. If you suspect a card is a proxy or fake, get somebody who is an expert in identifying the legitimacy of cards to verify that. And then you have to have an investigation with the player. Counterfeits these days are getting better and better. I remember in, like, middle school, people would bring in counterfeit Magic cards that were just printed on, like, cardstock from CVS. And so it was very clear that they were fake. Maybe they added a little bit of gloss to them, but they were very clearly fake cards. Now, cards look very good. In fact, they're often printed on similar machines as legitimate cards using similar stock. And experts can tell the difference, but it's very possible that a player traded for high-value cards, got counterfeits, and are unaware that they have fake cards. And so that investigation is very tricky. The easiest thing to do is if a player says, I traded for it, or I bought it from this source, you can ask for receipts or ask who they traded for the cards from. If a player's entire deck is counterfeit or proxy, or if, like, all of the high-value cards are counterfeit, that goes back to the collateral truths of, if they were like, oh yeah, I traded for all of these, every single one of my high-value cards that I traded for with a different player is a fake, and all of my low-value cards are not fake, I have some questions to ask, because that story doesn't hold up. But if somebody has, like, a one-of Vader that is a counterfeit, and the other Vaders and other high-value cards aren't, and they're like, yeah, I traded for this with a person at some large convention, I don't know them, I can't tell you their name, that is a very believable story. McFerguson, would it be reasonable to say that a proxy that looks good enough to you that you aren't sure, you shouldn't worry about it? I'm not sure what my answer is here. Give me a second to think about it. If you're concerned about a card, get somebody who's an expert to look at it. If you're not concerned, and if you don't have any reason to be concerned, don't worry about it too much. Yeah, as Curse Strife says, if they have them for practice before buying the cards to see if they work for them, but aren't using them in an actual event, no real issue there. If they're using them in events and not contributing to the game, you do have to consider if that's somebody that you want at your LGS event. That is true. And it's against tournament policy. You're not allowed to play in FFG sanctioned events with cards that aren't printed by FFG. That's one of their rules. And if you're not abiding by the rules, you're not allowed to play. So a player who's like, yeah, my entire deck is counterfeits, is a problem. Clearly everyone should just get a full playset of every set. I mean, that does, if FFG just gives that to everybody, that does somewhat limit their income and profit margins, which limits how much they can pay their designers, which limits how many new cards we get. So there is a problem. Sometimes capitalism is good. Sometimes. Capitalism is okay with luxury items. Star Wars Unlimited is a luxury item. Also, yeah, it keeps me in a job, and I like having a job, because I too live in capitalism and need to buy food, and that also costs money. So, yeah. Shall we move on? Great. We've talked about names, we've talked about investigations. We got a lot more to go. This is the first 2 subsections of 14. And we're 35 minutes in. I love this. I do genuinely enjoy chatting with all of y'all, both here in the Twitch stream and in Discord. It's great to have these conversations. But, moving on. Traits. Ooh, card type. Why? Oh, my script is out of order because my script was out of order, and now I'm going to trick myself and have to scroll up and down, and you're going to see me be real confused for a bit. Card types. Card types have their own rules, but they're going to be covered in the next lesson coming out on Monday. The types are base, event, leader, unit, upgrade, and token. Each type has its own rules about how you can play them, when you can play them, what they do when they're in play, how you get them into and out of play, all that good stuff. That's all we're going to talk about there real quick. Arena type. Units are either ground or space units. All units have an arena type, because otherwise you can't put them into play. I'm sure at some point we'll get a unit that has multiple arena types, but that's not now. Units can only attack units in the same arena, all ground units in the ground arena, all space units in the space arena. They can also attack any bases. Of course, necessary exception to this rule are strafing gunship and swoop down, which allow space units to attack ground units. This one's nice and easy. This one we don't have to worry about as much as names, which come up with communication. Communication is where policy occurs. Types, we don't have so many issues with that. Alright, what's the next section? Let's look at the actual rules. It's going to be cost. Yes, it's cost. I know it's happening in my own presentation that I made earlier this week. Cost indicates resources that must be paid to play the card. You start with the printed cost. You add any increases, including aspect penalties. You subtract any decreases. And then free bypasses cost modification. So it's plus minus 0 is how I think of it in my head. So our example here is U-Wing Reinforcement. You are able to play Count Dooku, even though in whatever deck you're playing U-Wing Reinforcement in, Count Dooku is going to have at least an aspect penalty of 2 and would cost 9 resources to play, but we're just looking at the printed cost when we're looking for an effect like U-Wing Reinforcement. Again, if Reinforcement Walker has its cost reduced, even if it's 7 or less, from like the next unit you play has its cost reduced by 1, you wouldn't be able to play that with U-Wing Reinforcement, even though they share the word reinforcement, and that modified cost of 7 is 7 or less. We're still, again, looking at printed cost. Additional costs still have to be paid even when you're playing something for free, and you have to be able to pay all additional costs in order to do something. Saw Gerrera continues to be the poster child of additional costs, because I still don't believe that they've made any cards with external additional costs. Yes, there's something like First Light that has multiple costs in its smuggle cost, but that isn't an additional cost. Saw Gerrera continuing to be special. Alrighty. Aspects. There are 6 of them. Vigilance, Command, Cunning, Aggression, Heroism, and Villainy. Leaders and bases have aspects in the upper right corner and provide these aspects to the deck. Everything else has them in the upper left corner and indicate what aspects you need to have in your deck in order to play those cards without an aspect penalty. This is one of the core rules of Star Wars Unlimited, and so if you're here and didn't know that, that's surprising, and we'll have a conversation about that. Next up, we have 4 whole sections in a row. Power, HP, power modifiers, and HP modifiers. Power is how much how much damage a unit deals in combat. When another card asks for a unit's power, it is looking at its total modified power, including modifiers from lasting effects or from upgrades, from experience counters, anything like that. Unless it says printed power, in which case it looks for the number that is printed on the card. Combat damage is only damage from an attack. Right now there's a little hole in the rules with Greedo. Right now the rules say combat damage is any damage that happens during the combat damage step, which is when units get defeated. If Greedo gets defeated, his trigger, technically by the rules of the game, combat damage, because that is damage being dealt during the combat damage step. But that's not what the folks writing the rules want it to be, and so please don't treat Greedo's trigger like combat damage if it happens during the combat damage step. So you can't kill Lurking TIE Phantom with your Greedo ability, even if you really, really want to. HP tracks how much damage a unit can take. You can't heal non-existent damage, and modifiers are added to a unit's power and HP. A unit's remaining HP is defined elsewhere, which is HP plus increases, minus decreases, minus damage counters on the unit. Generally, when a card refers to another unit's HP, that is going to be, it's going to specify remaining HP. I don't believe there are any cards that look at total HP right now. I believe they all do in fact specify remaining HP. And so you'll generally be taking into account damage on a unit. So at 4122 asks, Raid X ability is considered for the total power, and Nocturnal spawns only while attacking? Yep, that's correct. Raid is considered part of the power while the unit is attacking. So if a unit had on attack deal damage to defender equal to this unit's power, then you would be able to take into account Raid, because the unit attacks, Raid is turned on, the power is modified, the trigger occurs, we resolve the trigger, we look at the power in the moment, and in that moment, Raid is applying. If you attack with a unit that has Raid, a 2-power unit with Raid 1, so you're attacking for 3, you resolve that attack. After damage, you play Strike True. You're going to look, Strike True is going to look to see what power the unit has currently. The attack is complete, and so it no longer has that power modifier from Raid, and so Strike True would only deal 2 damage. Thank you, McFerguson, for looking stuff up on SWODB while I'm talking. That is genuinely incredibly helpful. And it's validating to know that my memory and searches match your searches. That, or you just have an insane memory and just know every card in the game. One of the two. Alrighty, traits. Hey, here's that card we were talking about earlier. It's the one card that says the word trait. According to McFerguson's perfect, flawless memory, and definitely not SWODB. Other cards can refer to traits. I think, like, Wedge Antilles is one of my favorite characters, and he refers to the vehicle trait. A card can have any number of traits. Printed cards, or the number of traits printed on a given card, is limited by the space on the card itself. So you're not going to have a Mandalorian Force Republic Separatist Jedi Trooper Rebel, but if you have effects like Foundling, you might be able to get there one day. Sections 2.13 and 2.14, we're getting here close to the finish line. 2.13 is text box. That contains the card's abilities and effects. As a reminder, reminder text doesn't take precedence over rules text. The reminder text on Sentinel is incomplete. It does not say that you cannot cause the unit to be unable to be attacked. Fett's Fire Spray, that reminder text doesn't really show up anywhere in the comprehensive rules. It's reminder about how names work, and that it doesn't care about the card type when we're looking at names. So at 4122, you're still seeing 2.8 to 2.11. That's interesting. Try refreshing the stream. It seems like other folks aren't having that issue. And then finally, on Overwhelm, when attacking an enemy unit, deal excess damage to the opponent's base. That is all true information, and I don't think it's missing anything. It just doesn't include the definition of what excess damage is. And so you have varying degrees of reliability when it comes to reminder text. Of course, this is also where card text exists and abilities exist. Each ability takes its own line, even if they're all keywords. If we look at our good friend Gore from Twilight of the Republic, he has 4 keywords just on 4 separate lines. I'm assuming his gender there, or Gore's gender there. I have no idea, and I don't really need to know. But finally, we have the credit line. The credit line is all that right there at the bottom of the card. It's useful for identifying the card and the artist. but is not part of the card's attributes and has no gameplay impact. This essentially means that if a card has different artist or is printed in a different set, it's still a copy. You can't be like, oh, well, my Vaders number 6 through 7 have a different collector number. I have my 3 normal ones, plus my 3 hyperspace ones, plus my 3 promo Vaders, and they all have different collector numbers and are from different sets, and so they're unique. You're not allowed to play 9 Darth Vaders. That is unfair, and so that is why credit line is not part of a card's attributes, because otherwise, if it did, you'd be able to play 9 Darth Vaders, and that's too many Darth Vaders. Alrighty, that wraps this up. I love that we spent 35 minutes on the first, 2 slides, and then 10 or 15 minutes on the back half of this. Really, a lot of what we were talking about is naming and communication, which is, hey, policy, which is, again, one of those more complex elements. As always, I'm going to hang out for a couple minutes. As we finish up this part of the broadcast, we'll stop the stream as soon as we no longer have questions, probably in 2 or 3 minutes, unless folks have questions and I go on one of them crazy tangents, as I so often do. Alrighty. Kurz Strife says, would love to see something from FFG on why they use the language unit deals damage equal to its power on events like Strike True instead of deal damage equal to the unit's power. That is a great question. I obviously don't know the answer. I'm not FFG. It might be grokkability for cases other than Lurking TIE Phantom. I know that TIE Fighter is a problem for many of us because there's some language questions. But yeah, I don't know. I think it's possible that they started that language, ran with it, printed it. Now they're like, yeah, this is a clarity issue with Lurking TIE Phantom, but errataing and changing the text on a bunch of cards isn't something that they're going to do until potentially reprints. I don't know. It's something that clarity is important, and Lurking TIE Phantom continuing to be a problem months after release, not mechanically, but just through clarity and intuition and what a lot of players think it does and how cards interact with it. That's hugely important. And so maybe they change the language on cards that are reprinted in the future to make it clear that it doesn't affect Lurking TIE Phantom. But I don't know. Alrighty, policy question from Tennessee Feet Monk. Regional Governor and Kira. If a player forgets to name a card and the opponent plays that card, is this a resolve it now and doesn't impact the current card being played, or is this a play on too bad situation? We don't have... I think what we do is you name the card now. However, the card that your opponent has played is already played, and so you don't get to be like, this mitigates the advantage of, I'm going to play Regional Governor, intentionally not name a card, wait until they play a threat, and then say, oh, that's the card I meant to name. We should, of course, investigate when this situation comes up, but by making it so you're allowed to name the card now, but you don't get to include the card that is currently being played, helps mitigate some of that advantage. Of course, that does open the window for the opponent to say, oh, I just didn't hear them name Avenger, and I'm playing Avenger now, so you have to let me play Avenger. This is one of those situations where you investigate, pull up collateral truths, and figure out if somebody's lying to you. I would generally have it resolve now, doesn't impact the current card being played. Because the card is supposed to have named a card. If it's possible that rewinding to the point of error is reasonable, like if the only thing that's happened since we realized that we didn't name something is a couple units attack back and forth and no cards have been played, or the only cards have been played by the player who controls Regional Governor or Kira, then we can probably pretty safely rewind and name the card there. Let's see. Another policy question from Tennessee Feet Monk. There's no clarification on Nexus or the master event document for outside assistance. Right now, I don't know if there's anything in the works. I think this is one of the things that I've raised. But right now, I'd use your judgment. Do you feel that the information this player has gained has affected the outcome of the match? Has it affected just the outcome of the game? Has it not done anything? Keep in mind that if a player receives outside assistance but doesn't solicit it, they haven't done anything wrong, even though they have gained an advantage. So don't penalize players for getting information, because otherwise I could go to an event and then just tell all of my friend's opponents what my friend has in their hand, and then my friend wins all of their matches. We don't want to encourage that. We don't want to enable that. So right now, outside assistance is a per case situation where you're going to evaluate how much damage has been done to the current game versus the current match. If it's something like, hey, they have this card in their hand right now, and it's a card that was previously known, or if it's like, don't forget about the Avenger that you just waylaid, that is outside assistance, it's damaging the game. Or if the player's like, hey, can somebody remind me what cards they have in their hand? That's... If the player doesn't know better, you educate them and probably apply a game or match loss if they're soliciting it. If a player is giving information without it being solicited, you have a very stern talking to with them about it and give them an appropriate penalty. If a player is doing this on purpose and they know they're not allowed to do it, that's just straight up cheating. Policy question. Issuing proxies for warp foiling or no? I don't have clear policy on this. It's one of the things that I want to talk with FFG about because it's so heavily debated. I know that the folks from FFG do occasionally look in on the Discord and look at the high volume topics to see what's being discussed. For me, my reflex is no proxy on warped foils. I think there is a line where it becomes unreasonable to issue proxies for warped foils. If a player has like 1 or 2 cards in their deck that are foil, and they're just like, I wasn't able to find non-foil copies, I've done my best to flatten them out, I have like a desiccant pack in my deck box to make sure that everything remains dehumidified and nothing warps and that sort of thing, yeah, I can replace that one. If a player shows up and 40 cards are warped and 10 cards aren't, I'm issuing 40 proxies. 1 is not only disruptive to the event, but 2 makes it very hard for their opponents to know what's going on, because every single card isn't what it actually says it is, and it's whatever I Sharpied on it. So right now there isn't any firm policy. I would, for small issues, it's something we can fix and we can get the player back to playing. If it's a significant portion of a player's deck, I don't want to give a hard number here, and it would be disruptive to the event to issue that many proxies, I don't think we can issue proxies. Another thing that you need to take into consideration is where you're playing and the accessibility of these cards. If you're playing in a local game store and it's 8 players and one player has, for example, 3 foil Vaders that are warped, and the store doesn't have any copies on hand, and none of the other players have a copy on hand, the player cannot get copies. They cannot get replacement copies reasonably. Yeah, sure, they could buy several boxes and rip open hundreds of packs trying to find 3 non-foil Vaders, but the store would have to have many boxes for them to buy, and asking a player to do that isn't reasonable. If it's, hey, we need you to replace one of your takedowns with a non-foil takedown, it's very likely that that card will be something that the store has, or a player will have a spare copy of, or a player might have a non-foil copy in a deck. So take into account the accessibility of the cards that need to be replaced and how disruptive it is to the event. If you're able to replace 45 of the cards because people have the commons and uncommons that are marked, and you just need to replace a couple of like foil legendaries, then you can do a mix of replacing cards and issuing proxies. We just want people to play the game with their cards, and we don't want to penalize people for buying cards from the game, because that sucks. In the case of an errata, the complete rules clarification will take precedence over card text. Yes. In the case of errata or changes to card text, which I don't know if it will happen because I believe it's something that they want to avoid, it is likely that they will announce where the source of truth is. Right now, the card database available on StarWarsUnlimited.com is the source of truth for what a card says. So if you don't have an English copy of the card, or if a card gets an errata, you can go to StarWarsUnlimited.com, go to the card database, look up the name of the card, and that will tell you what the card does. Curse Strife. For OA, the Master Event Doc does say part of the spectator's responsibilities is to not interfere, and they can be asked to leave. That is true, but it is OA or outside assistance should probably be more strictly regulated, simply because it can be so impactful on the outcome of an event, especially in, say, a win-and-in situation for top 8. One word or one name of a card can turn a match from one way to the other. Another policy question from Tennessee Feet Monk. Deck boxes with more cards than just the 50-10 in same sleeves, i.e. potentially for sideboarding a card not on the deck list. What's the solution? This would likely, it would likely be a deck problem. However, if the player, at the beginning of the match, pulls out their deck and their sideboard and says, this is my deck, this is my sideboard, and keeps them out of the deck box for the duration of the match, and they have other cards in that deck box, then that's okay. They have clearly identified these 10 cards are my sideboard, these 50 cards are my deck, or however many cards they're running in deck and sideboard. And other cards in their deck box aren't a problem, because their opponent knows the 10 cards that are on top of the deck box and not inside it are the sideboard. If they open up the deck box and start rooting around in the deck box during sideboarding, I'm going to call a judge. But yeah, I would, if that's discovered during a deck check, I would consider that to fall most comfortably under deck problem, because there's a problem with the decks that they have handed to you. With the physical cards, not with the deck list. No breaks, I just want to point out the author of record on those articles is Eric Shukan. It's just published under Evan Cherry because that's who was running that project at the time. And yeah, the philosophy that we're talking about, there is no firm philosophy on this right now for Star Wars Unlimited. In fact, if you look at the Master Event document, it currently says that a judge can ask to see a player's deck between rounds, which is the time when the player, if a player is cheating and making modifications to their deck, they're not going to do it between rounds. They're going to do it when they know what they're playing against. And so checking decks between rounds isn't the best time. And so I'm pretty confident that the policy around deck checks is going to continue to grow and improve. This is one of those situations that it currently isn't covered by policy, but also deck checks in general aren't well covered by policy. So that's an area of growth for the game. With that, I'm going to hang out for another 10-20 seconds unless I see another question, and then we're going to call things a day. Managed to pull out a full hour of this. As always, good chatting with you. I'll be back in the Discord. Oh, more policy questions from Tennessee Feet Monk. I like the little stinger at the end. I think that it is important to... So, that's what policy says. I've talked with FFG. They think that you should be doing deck checks during rounds. It's just not in the documents right now. What you should do, and this will eventually be in the documents, is after players have presented their deck, but before they've drawn opening hands, check check some decks. What you do is you go to the table, you say, hey players, we're going to be performing a deck check. Go ahead, take your deck, put in your deck box along with your sideboard. We're going to take a quick look at things. Doing random deck checks is very important for the integrity of the event, not because you're able to catch cheaters or because you're able to catch errors, because even if you check one deck every round in a 4-round event with 16 players, you're still only looking at 8 decks out of like 80 or more decks that were presented throughout the event. But by doing deck checks, and by doing them randomly and without giving players warning about them, with small jump scares, it means that somebody who does have malicious intent has to be aware of the fact that they could be deck checked. And so doing deck checks and making sure that players are aware that you're doing deck checks are a great preventative measure, and keeping cheaters out of the game. We don't want them. And doing deck check, one of my favorite stories is the first event at Magic the Gathering where they did mid-round deck checks, so after decks had been sideboarded. Players weren't expecting that, because for years, if you weren't deck checked at the beginning of the round, you wouldn't be deck checked for the entire round, because people hadn't figured out how to do a deck check after sideboarding had occurred. All you do is you don't change the deck, and you have to do a little bit more comparing. If a card shows up on the deck list and isn't there, you'll look to see if it's in the sideboard and vice versa. But they DQ'd dozens of players that week because players had gotten used to the idea that you don't get deck checked after your first game. And so people were like, okay, now is a safe time to cheat. And so waving that flag of, hey everybody, I'm doing a deck check here, gets everybody's attention. They know that you're doing a deck check. They know that deck checks can happen. They know that a deck check can happen to them, and keeps players who may be less than honest, or who just really, really want to win, it keeps them from doing something that they would later regret. And that's all we've got for today. Fantastic. Thank you all so much for showing up. I'll see you next time. Have a good one.